Hi, I'm Sheri Blackmon, and we've been married 40 years. We met in college, Westmont College, and I still remember I took note of him. He was an all-American guy, and I grew up overseas, so I had we moved back and forth a lot. I had some insecurities, and so I really liked his confidence. The first time I noticed him was we were on a group date with different people, and halfway through, he leaned over to me and said, "I'd like to get to know you better." And that's when I first noticed his...
When I was dating another woman there?
Well, casually.
I guess.
He was so direct, and I love that. But so then, during that time, I was kind of into somebody else, and we developed a friendship. I would tell him about the guy, and Rick would listen and give me good advice. And then one time we were on, it was a dance with the school at the Queen Mary. And I was with this guy and Rick was with someone else. And my date was a dud. But I watched Rick. He was with this girl and they were having so much fun. I thought, I'm missing out. That's when I started taking note of him. And we had a friendship for a long time, about 6 months. And then we started to kind of realized that we were falling for each other. I was always looking for a guy who was both athletic and academic, and that's sometimes hard to find. But Rick met both of those. I got to check off those 2 boxes. And so then we started dating and got married a year and a half later at age 23.
So I'm Rick Blackmon, and I'm a therapist and have been for 40 years. And Sheri, she didn't say this about herself, but she was in ministry for a long time and then taught at Oaks Christian, which maybe a lot of people would know, for 19 or 20 years.
19.
A long time, just retired fairly recently. And yes, we met in college at Westmont College. And for me, Sheri was the exotic girl from Europe on the campus. And I always felt smitten with her, even from afar. So when I said I wanted to get to know her, I think it was really more in friendship. I wasn't thinking, maybe I wasn't thinking that I was in her league, to be honest. But I thought she was the prettiest girl on campus. I legitimately thought that. And I still think she's the prettiest girl I know. So yeah, I like Sheri's, and she's talking about attributes that you knew or thought about at the beginning. Pretty, very bright. I had taken some classes with Sheri, religious studies classes. That was one of her majors. And I like the way her mind works. My mother was the most loving person that I've ever known, but she was not an intellectually challenging type of person. And I knew from the time that I was young that I wanted somebody loving like my mother, but somebody that would be more of a partner kind of person. And Sheri really fit that well. She was also a literature major. She was a double major in college, and I'm a reading fanatic. And so that Sheri liked that. And she wrote poetry. I'm not a poet, but I liked reading her poetry even when we were young. So I think it was good chemistry, and I was smitten really from the beginning. We have been married 40 years, and we have 3 children that maybe some of you in the audience wouldn't even know are kids. They're 36, 34, and 27. So,
So it was great to... Rick really was a person that I could trust. I'd had a very difficult relationship before that, and he was someone who just represented security, stability, and fun, and someone that I could really not worry about whether he'd break my trust. And it was really important to me that he really wanted me, and I think that is an important, when you're dating, to have someone that really loves and wants you. When I met Rick, the thing that really stood out to me was his confidence, like I said. And he is just a very trustworthy person. I knew that right from the beginning. And I really needed that because I'd come out of a hurtful relationship. And boy, I wasn't going to trust anybody. I was healing from that. And so when I met Rick, it just felt very safe. And speaking as a woman, it was and still continues to be such a fantastic resource to be loved, to have this love that you know is a bedrock. Because Rick his love has never changed. And it's proven itself so many times, especially in recent years. I've gone through 2 cancer experiences, and Rick has just been my rock. I don't know what I would have done without him. And to have that, that greeting every morning, the kiss, the love, the affirmation has just been incredible.
I knew when we were dating that she was damaged before. And I remember you told me about it. Of course, I learned much more about that whole experience and the trauma of it later. But I remember thinking, she's going to take a while, and I might, not get trusted fully in some ways as a function of that. But I just remember having this conscious thought, she's worth it. And I was totally right after all these years. Though I think it took a long time, and we just have these interesting stories. That was very unfinished business for Sheri. And, the idea that Sheri and I are very fond of, I think it fits in our relationship and many other marriages, that when you marry, whatever issues you have that need attention, they're going to come out. You won't know that early on, but the marriage, if it's, I would say it's probably designed by God to be a growth vehicle. And so she has trust issues, or I have issues about being loved apart from what I do. I'm kind of an achievement sort of oriented person. That's going to come out in the relationship. And, Freud, I'm not a Freudian, but Freud thought that we were all guilty of what he called the repetition compulsion. You're going to just repeat the problems from your past. But I think Sheri and I would look at it as an opportunity to do further work. So if you can do that certainly single, but I feel like if you get married, your issues are going to come to the surface. Mm-hmm. And so they have done so, I think, in our relationship. But we have been through a lot. When we had a lot of simpatico with, we both like theology, and we liked literature, and we liked ministry. We went to Fuller Seminary together, and we had all kinds of friends that were in ministry together. So we had a lot of kind of kindred spirit kind of material, I think. Almost became a part of a ministry team together. That would have been an interesting path, but didn't quite end up doing that. I went a little bit of a different direction into the counseling world. And then we had these 3 children, and yes, this cancer thing, which Sheri just mentioned, was first in 2002, and then again in 2019. Those were enormous and continue in some ways to be significant challenges, but just kind of puts to the test. That's what I like about marriage, is going through ups, and we have had many great experiences together too.
Yeah, so I think that marriage should strengthen a person. When people are considering, should I marry this person, I think does that person make me better? And Rick definitely does that for me, did that and does that. So many times I lacked confidence. I went into the ministry and then teaching, and Rick has always just built me up and helped me gain confidence and challenged me to do more. It's really great to feel that that person is pushing you out of your comfort zone.
Such a simple question, isn't it? And I like it too. Does the person that you're with bring out the best in you or make you a better person? And I feel unquestionably I'm a better man in the world because of meeting and marrying Sheri. And again, that doesn't mean anything remotely like perfect. But no one's going to know my flaws better than Sheri Blackmon. And for her to figure out ways to help me see those and work through those in a way that doesn't. I'm very naturally defensive. She'll tell you that. I come from a family of fighters and defenders. And so she's had to learn, and I've had to learn when I'm talking about, she has fewer flaws than me, but she has a few as well. That's an opportunity to grow into a better version of yourself. And I love thinking about marriage in that way, that it's a opportunity for God to develop you and grow you.
Yeah, so there's two parts to it. There's the part a marriage does help heal. A good marriage does help heal some wounds, but it also is a challenge. And so I think the important thing is to ask yourself, what is my view of marriage? Do I just want a marriage? Do I want a soulmate who's going to accept me for how I am and never require change? And with whom I have the illusion it's going to be easy, and when there's conflict, is something wrong? Or do I want someone who is both, challenging and healing? And I think we like the term kindred spirit versus soulmate. Soulmate gets a little bit into this, you have to complete me, a little bit elevating the marriage, putting maybe too much pressure on it. It's just our opinion. And so there's those two aspects to marriage. There's the part that you have unsolvable problems, or at least they can seem unsolvable. And then you also have some really great times. There's some wonder in it. So we like to think in terms of a good marriage incorporating both of those.
It's a very simple little idea from the psychology world that marriages go through stages, and you could just really simplify it and say the first is a dependency stage where you're drawn to one another, and then after that bond is cemented, you go into the independency stage. You want to have your own voice in the context of the relationship. And if you achieve the dependency and then the independency, you move, I think, into the stage that we mostly feel like we're in, more of an interdependent stage. And I like that idea where Sheri is, as I mentioned earlier, very different than my mother. She's got a strong voice and a definite opinion about things, which I like. That was very intentional. I mean, at the same time, that can be challenging sometimes. Okay, maybe a fewer opinions would be good. But I actually don't really mean that. The very best part of me likes that. And so that combination of healing, because I feel too, I grew up I loved my parents, but there were ways in which I was always seeking approval by achieving and pleasing others. And so brought that into the marriage and ended up being more dependent on Sheri's approval than I think was ultimately even healthy. And it was the marriage and the dynamic and Sheri pushing against that that's even helped me even to understand that and know that about myself. So that's been great.
So those three phases he was referring to are really, the first phase is the romance phase, when the purpose is to bond. And so the differences they sort of get washed over. And then you can think in terms of, we are the same people. We are so alike. Then the disillusionment phase comes in, where you realize there are some significant differences. In fact, I would say the longer you're married, the more you realize there are differences. So that's the challenge, is what are you going to do about those differences? Are you going to let them be, or are you going to try to make your spouse into who you want them to be, or the person you're dating? And so it's really important to be okay with that in that independent stage. And then the question is, are we going to work together, and are we going to weather this disillusionment? Because it's very, very common to be disillusioned.
I always think of this little story. Sheri laughs at me when I tell it, that I was a baseball player, and you might know baseball players, when they get older, they become softball players. And so when I married Sheri, she didn't know anything about baseball or softball, coming from Europe. And I would want her to come to the games to watch me play softball. So she would come faithfully. And after being married for a little while, she would come less often. And then finally, she wasn't coming at all. And I remember one day, she doesn't even remember this, I asked her, Sheri, why don't you come to the softball games anymore? And she looked me in the eye and she said, I hate softball. I had no idea. But it captures exactly what Sheri was saying in that early stage of bonding. You kind of zero in on what your partner wants you to be, and that's what you are. But as you get comfortable, as Sheri got comfortable, she wanted to more be herself. And now, of course, we had 3 sons who played countless baseball games that she had to go to. And she still will tell you that she sort of likes baseball, but I just thought that was such an interesting moment to kind of recognize those stages. As a counselor, I am fond of saying and thinking that the primary challenge for any marriage that's trying to be a long and healthy one is exactly what Sheri is saying. How do you deal with differences? And I completely agree with Sheri's sentiment that the longer you are with your partner, your spouse, the more different you will become. You will not get more similar. You will get more different. And so if you get good at handling those differences with courage and grace and forgiveness, then you can have a perfectly fine marriage, even though you're married to someone increasingly, Tim Keller calls it, have you realized that you're married to an alien or a stranger? Mm. His whole chapter is in his book, The Meaning of Marriage, on that. And if you've been married for a while, you know exactly what he means. Though I would never have thought that when we were dating at Westlake College, and it seemed like everything I liked, she liked, and vice versa. So if you get good at those differences, you can have a great and healthy marriage. If you're really lousy at dealing with someone who's different than you, then you might not be able to have a very healthy marriage.
Yeah, and I think when you're dating, those differences, like we said, don't come out as fast as they do later on. Yeah. But one way that you can allow the differences to come out is to not become sexually intimate. Because once you do, there's a strong bond that masks the differences. And so then it leaves you with less information you'll get later on. But if you want more information as to your differences and how you operate in life, then I would say take it slowly when you're dating.
And just to maybe slightly go into more detail about differences, we've been playing around with this idea for a long time that when you're with a partner, you're different in your gender, your personality, your background, and your values. And ultimately, the most important one, I think you and I would say, is taking a good look at your values, because you're going to, sort of based on what Sheri and I were just sharing, over time learn more and more about how a man is different than a woman. You're going to learn more and more about how you're married to a different personality than yourself. Take any kind of test you want. You're most likely not going to come out as a clone of the person that you're with, that you're dating, or that you're married to. And certainly your backgrounds. Now, ours are even more different in some ways. I mean, we're racially the same and whatnot, so there's a lot of similarities. But she grew up in Germany. I grew up in America. She was in a missionary family. I was not in anything remotely like that. And then when you start having kids, even more of those background differences, I think, will surface. And so that idea of not doing even sexually things that sort of mask those differences or maybe make you not have as much courage to look them. If I'm doing premarital, I want a couple who's wondering about getting married to take a look at these kinds of things as honestly as possible. This is not a very in vogue thing probably to say about sexuality in this day and age, but it's still a biblical standard in our mind, and for some of the reasons that we're talking about, just has always made sense.
Yeah, so to have conversations about values is really important. It can sound kind of heady, but it's basically you're trying to have a conversation about your philosophy of life, your worldview. So, for example, why am I here? The purpose question. What is the purpose of marriage? If the purpose of marriage is self-fulfillment, that's quite a different thing than it being mutual fulfillment and mutual sacrifice. Self-fulfillment is a very dangerous road to go down because that doesn't lend itself to a long-term relationship.
Or at least as the only factor,
right.
Or even maybe the main factor. Is it larger than that? And ferreting that out if you can.
So having conversations with each other about, what is my view of the purpose of life, the purpose of marriage? What is my view of male and female, of humanity? Are we fallen? Are we good? Are we a mixture of both? Or what is it? And to have these conversations at the philosophical, deepest level is not heady at all. It is it helps those differences to come out and the values. So I really feel it's important to have similar values. Of course, as Christians, we're told to date other Christians, to marry other Christians. And that's very important. We've been attending church together our whole life. We've been leading small groups and doing ministry. And that's been such a support for us, because when there are difficult times, to follow God's word and to be patient and long-suffering and kind and all those things that don't come naturally really help build up a relationship. So these philosophical questions are important. Things like, how do I know truth? On what basis do I make my ethical decisions? How do I even know things? Do I know them based on just my feelings? Do I know them based on some objective standard? And so to have those types of conversations will bring up and show some of the underpinnings of your life and whether they're compatible with the other person.
You can tell in the relationship here who the philosopher and theologian is. And when I think of what Sheri's saying, I could listen to you for a long time. But I'm the psychologist in the relationship, and the idea about differences that we're talking about, the statistical look at it is the hardest area of difference to overcome are value differences. Mostly the ones that Sheri's talking about, but I'd even broaden it a little bit, like core values, the things that drive you from the inside, that animate you, like your worldview. But also your values around money, your values around faith, of course, what Sheri's talking about, your values around leisure and around friendships and around extended family and in-laws, all of those. Those are the things that are going to be the highest stakes issues. Those are the things that probably are the most challenging. It's hard enough to deal with male-female differences and personality differences, but demonstrably it seems clear to our experience, and certainly to mine as a therapist, that the deep core value differences are the things that drive, even the fulfillment thing that Sheri just brought up. If the most important thing is that I feel fulfilled, which leaves less room for other orientation or being sacrificial in your love, I would want to expose that. If one person has that more sacrificial view, I would say a New Testament view about love and agape love, and the other is more with the sort of times about, how things are feeling, and if I'm not feeling fulfilled, then maybe I need to look at doing something different. That would be a really important value to see if you could expose early on, because that's not going to play well over time. And trying to get a couple or yourself, if you're dating, to really be ruthlessly honest about things like that will pay dividends, because otherwise you're going to end up in my office. And I can tell you, in my office, I feel like I'm pretty good at helping couples deal with differences in those gender areas and personality areas and background issues. If their values are really different, then I still might be able to be helpful, and I'm going to try, but I'm not always going to succeed as often. That's just going to be true.
So it's tricky, because it's not just we have to agree politically. We have to agree on everything.
Yeah.
You're talking about deeper.
Yeah, you want to agree on those deeper core values. Mm-hmm. That's the area you'd want to have the most agreement on, definitely. So,
yeah, communication is a big thing. You hear that all the time, that the most important thing is communication. In some ways it is. I think under the undergirding part of that is, are you committed to communication? Are you committed to working things out? One of the things I've always appreciated about Rick is that when I communicate something that I think needs changing, he might be defensive, but eventually works through it. I have to push through it too. And then he has always been willing to hear me. That is so important to give a relationship hope. If you feel like you're talking to someone and it just goes in one ear out the other, or there's just a wall, it starts eroding that trust in the relationship. So even more than just skills, it's about, am I willing to change? Or do I feel that marriage is for me to be just built up and supported? And so, that's the basis. And then we've developed some communication skills.
And a fundamental, just to addendum what you're saying there, as I think about communication, this is a very psych-sounding phrase, forgive me, but I ran across it by one author. He talks about, do you have authentic self-representation? He calls it ASR. And what he means is, do you have the kind of relationship where the fundamental lens is knowing and being known? Are you able to represent, he talks about this author, your thoughts, your feelings, your intentions, your positions, your emotions accurately in a way that your partner can know you? And does that go both ways? And so anything that we would say or any other couple would say to me about communication would be towards that end. Communication is about knowing and being known. And if I think it's more about that than, Sheri, are your needs being fully met? Or Rick, are your needs? That's important. That matters. But I don't think it matters as much. If I was going to use a lens to try to gauge how is the communication going, I would use the one that Sheri's talking about, that knowing idea.
Yeah, so we developed a little...
why don't you tell them about that,
a little tool. It's called ABCs, and we've talked about it here before. But so this is a tool for communication. If so, you have a is a great grade, B is okay, and C is not good.
No D's or F's, right?
Right.
At least that's this.
And it has to do with communication. So why don't you introduce it? And
so what this idea kind of gets at is that in a good relationship, it's good to ask for what you want. And indeed, in many relationships, that's the problem. People don't ask for what they want. But the caveat, so if I ask for something from Sheri that I want, again, specifically, what do I want from my wife? What does she want from her husband? That I think it's good for me to think whatever I'm asking for, it's a good thing to be able to ask for, to know what I want, what I desire. But the caveat is Sheri, in her response to what I want, is going to be in one of three, we call them like modes, A, B, or C. If she's an A, she wants, let's say something silly, I want to take you to the Dodger game this weekend. So if Sheri, and I say, Sheri, are you an A, a B, or a C? And we have been doing this for 25, 30 years, I bet. If she was an A, it means she wants to go too. Okay, well, that's easy. If everything I wanted, she wanted too, or everything she wanted, I wanted too, we would never need therapy. We would never need, we wouldn't have any problems. But that only goes like that in the dating days, and maybe even there just for a little while. If she was a B to go to the Dodger game, and we could do this either way. Sheri could ask me, Rick, do you want to garden with me on Saturday? And I could be an A, I really want to, or a B, Sheri and I define that as it would please me to please you, or a cheerful accommodation. A is an easy accommodation, a B is a cheerful, but it's not like she really wants to go to the Dodger game. She might like it better if I took Sarah Sawinski along so she could talk to Sarah during the game and something like that. But it's still, I think we talked about this a long time ago. This is similar to agape love, where you put the interests of the one you love above your own.
Yeah, so the B is really critical because it has to do with two things. You have to know your opinion. You have to know what you want, because a lot of people get sort of into this way of being, I don't know what I want. It's not important. So you have to know. Yeah. And then the recipient has to welcome it. And that's the tricky part. Oh, a B? No, you can't do that. Okay, B is self-giving. A B is about the relationship of the we in the marriage, not the me in the marriage.
You're doing it for the we.
Yeah,
That's
and so
good.
so much of it has to do with how it's received. And this really started working for us when, for example, I would say something and say it's a B, and then Rick would receive it well. Instead of There were a few times when he would pout, and then that wasn't working. But when he started to receive,
you're saying I would pout if you said it was a B, and you think about it. If I want something, of course I want it to be an A, and vice versa. That's just idealistic to think that's always going to be the case in any relationship, certainly a marriage one. So you're saying that you would say, I'm a B for that, and I would pout. That's so true. So I have the gift of pouting at times. That is so true.
That's what really turns it around, is if you accept the B and you realize it's not imperfect. It's an act of giving. It's an act of another person.
It's actually a higher form, arguably, of giving.
Yeah, in the Christian worldview.
In the Christian view, like I'm doing something that's not just, it's sacrificial. Just to complete the idea, so you can see where this is going. The C, if I say, you want to go to the Dodger game, or she says, you want to garden this Saturday, if the answer was a C, that's a resentful accommodation. So she'd be going to the Dodger game with me, but she didn't really want to go. And of course, my best self, whether it's wanting sex or whether it's wanting to go to the game or do this for a vacation, my best self doesn't want Sheri to join if she's a C, if she's resentful. And we kind of think this takes the desire question in marriage from a two-issue dilemma to three, A, B, and C. And that in a healthy relationship, you end up getting comfortable with A's and B's and trying to minimize C's.
You can't eliminate C's. I mean, it's not realistic.
Can't. Yeah, that's true.
But you just try to, like you said, minimize them.
I would say if, as a therapist, if a couple comes in and there's been a lot of what, as we just defined, a lot of C-level giving in their relationship, that's harmed the marriage. The we, as you talked about it earlier, is probably taken a hit. And so trying to, again, just as a little tool for communicating, to be like really good, ask for what you want, have the kind of relationship where you're not shy about your wishes and your desires, but you only accommodate A's and B's, and you try to stay away from C's. And, Sheri's good. It's a C, but maybe next week it'll be a B or an A, or, you can use the tool in a way as a negotiating thing. But I think what Sheri said about the reaction, if I ask for something and it's a C, then how do we put that, Sheri? We want to be graceful if the answer is a C, grateful if the answer is a B. And I think that's just a good, and we don't always do this perfectly by any means. We're both pretty strong personalities, but that has helped us tremendously. And I've used it as a therapist countless times with couples as well.
And another thing that we learned as a part of this framework is that when the person's expressing a wish, there's a good way to express the wish, not as a demand, as a wish. Like, to convey it as, I would like this, but I can handle it. I'm okay if it doesn't happen. If you put a demand on it, oh boy, that's, You
stumbled on that idea, I think, in our first 5 years of marriage. And I think that was so, I don't even know where you got that. Maybe you made it up. But that idea is just so useful. Like, you can wish for whatever you want. She's always saying that. You can wish for whatever you want. And that's true. It doesn't mean that you get everything that you want. Who does? And part of this issue is helps you grow up into an adult. I always think, I'm a grown man. I'm almost 65 years old now, but I'm a grown man. I should be able to ask for what I want, but that doesn't mean I always get what I want. Who does? You don't.
But you don't stop asking.
You don't stop
You don't
asking.
shut down your feelings and your desires. You have to continue to ask and to be aware of what you want.
Now, if you're married and every time you ask for something, it's a C, call your local therapist. That's a problem. You need, and certainly if you're dating somebody and everything that you want is a C, that should be a red flag. That should be a red flag.
Well, I think a few things that jump out. One is if there's a lot of resentful giving.
Yeah. I haven't thought of that, but yeah.
Another thing is if the dynamic is such that one person is pushing, the other one's retreating, I don't think that's healthy. value differences.
I mean,
are
that's
key.
the first thing that hits me.
Value
is
differences.
If you're like taking a listen to what we've been talking about and you're asking questions about core values, those deep things that Sheri mentioned, and you end up seeing my values really are different. It's not going to go well into the future. You could get married, and I think that would be, when I do premarital, I would say once a year. I do a bunch of those every year. A couple will break up because of the premarital, and it's always over this question of core values. And that's sad, that's painful. There's lots of grief and mourning, but I end up weirdly thinking that was like a service that that they figured this out now. So that would be my main answer to that question about when to end a relationship. I learned. Another way, by the way, I'll think about it is when you're dating somebody, I stole this from somebody else too. I think of the 3 C's: chemistry, compatibility, commitment. So chemistry, are you drawn to the person physically, emotionally? Are you drawn to them? Doesn't have to be the best chemistry of your life. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. If you can check that, I think of these as roughly in sequence. Then the next issue, and the one probably requiring the most due diligence, is compatibility. And if you're incompatible, to answer that question again, at the deep value list level, you're not checking that one off. And I think that's where I would want to end a relationship. And that's where, I think people are probably in some ways better at this today than even before. Almost maybe too good at it, but people are really such consumers, I think, about. They don't realize in some ways, if you're marrying someone, they're a very flawed person. You're not going to marry somebody who's already a finished product. They're gonna hopefully grow and change and transform. But so I'd check chemistry, check compatibility, and even then you have a choice, right? That's the commitment piece, which we would both take very seriously. But yeah, so I guess there's various things that, I like what you said too, Sheri, about the push-pull thing. If one person's way more into the relationship than the other person, that is another thing that I don't think will play well over time.
Yeah, I think it's important to be proactive, not reactive. And like you said, to start early. You don't want to start too early, scare the person away, but to engage in a conversation early on about boundaries. And, so many times when people are in relationships, it's easy to just forget about your friends and to focus so much on this relationship. And I always enjoy the couples who are still pursuing their friendships in their own lives and taking it slowly and discussing these issues before they become critical. So that's, I think, a good idea.
Yeah, it feels like if you're setting parameters, you're kind of pacing the relationship, and you're doing that even in your conversation. Like our connection, our time together, our physical intimacy is commensurate with some time that we've been together and pacing it. And I always, as a counselor, I always think people should pace things more slowly than they instinctively want to. And I think, as you're saying it, Sheri, to be proactive and verbal about that, which, again, strikes me as slightly an old-fashioned idea, but this is a church and this is a community committed to a biblical worldview, and it's hard to improve on that biblical worldview, I think, in terms of maturity. I mean, I didn't kiss Sheri at the altar for the first time or anything remotely like that. So that can be taken to an extreme, I think, too. But just pacing.
Well, and to develop patience. Patience is really needed in a marriage. So if you can develop it when you're dating, delayed gratification is another way to speak of it. But patience is a biblical virtue. Forbearance. I think those things are missing today. And it's very valuable to pursue that.
I suppose you could get an early read on whether your dating partner is the type of person who can want something and not necessarily have it realized right now. which ends up playing so well in the future, like you just said. Like that's just a hallmark issue. You want to know what I want, but you also want to know that I could delay realization of that. And there may be some things I'm never going to get. I don't know, that sort of thing. That'd be a good thing to know. That's such a character piece.
Yeah.
I really agree with what you said. Yeah, that patience as a character virtue plays really well in a functional and healthy relationship versus its opposite. I think it's almost an impossible question to answer, to be honest. Like, when do you know? It feels to me like that's easily an invitation to being the consummate consumer who never makes a choice. So at the risk of not sounding appropriately romantic, I don't think I believe, or we probably believe, that there's just one person and it's your job to sort of magically find that one person. Both of our moms talked about, praying for the little girl that you were going to marry or the little boy that you were going to marry and wondering who that person was. And I sort of like the sound of that. But the truth is, I think if you want to have a good marriage, you want to maybe be more committed to being a good partner than have it just be about finding a good partner. Yes, do your due diligence on the compatibility and the chemistry and all that stuff. But I feel like most of the time, and I think our marriage would testify, we're very different. We have learned, not in those core values, but in so many other ways. And after 40 years, we know a lot more about that. But if the emphasis, and this is, by the way, Psychology 101, if you want to make headway in your relationship, don't focus on your partner. If you focus on your partner, you will probably be disappointed. But if you focus on your own part, your side of the street, as they say, it is very likely that you will make progress. So having that going into the dating, even getting engaged, and again, it doesn't mean you should be with anybody out there, but there would be certain types that you have. I went for the exotic European type, for example. But anyway, that's what I would
that's
say.
a really good point, because that should be your attitude going into relationship is on myself. If I always give over control to the other person, like, when you do this, then I will, that's not going to be helpful. So I like that. That's very, very mature and sound.
There's a funny saying, maybe we'll close with this. There's a saying in the psychology world: if you want to change your spouse, you have to do three things. First, you have to lose interest in changing your spouse. Second, you have to lose interest in changing your spouse. And thirdly, you have to lose interest in changing your spouse. And what that means, and I've seen this constantly as a counselor, is if you put the effort more into transforming yourself with God's help and not toward your partner, and you accept your partner for who they are, and out of that acceptance, you actually will be able to influence them for change. So if Sheri feels like I am angling, campaigning to change her, that's not going to work very well with my wife. But it doesn't work very well with me either. But if I feel loved and accepted, and she's challenging me, she just said something a couple nights ago, that's not your best self, Rick. And I was kind of in this defensive mode, but a short time later, I thought, she is 100% right. I wasn't being my best self. But I could hear that because I wasn't feeling like she's campaigning and angling and had mostly an interest in changing me. So I certainly think she's been more influential to my formation as a person than any person on the planet, but not because she's sought out and angled and campaigned to do so.
Yeah, and from a female perspective, that's men just don't react well to that. I think the Apostle Paul understood that as well when he talked about how wives should win their husbands over with manner of life as opposed to trying to convince them. But I think it works both ways. Yeah. It's just a human thing. You don't want to be controlled. What kid likes to be controlled?
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that gets back to how do you communicate expectations or wishes?
Yeah.
As wishes, not demands. Yeah. The less you can put demands on a person, the better.
Yeah, wishes just feel differently, don't they? Like I said, okay, so she's wishing for it, but the world won't end if she doesn't get what she wishes for. I just engage with that so differently. You're right. So.